As you know, if you've been here the past few weeks, we're in the middle of a series on the 10 Commandments. So I want to start by recapping what we've done so far. Our theme for the first week was God is love. God is love. Because when the commandments appear in the Bible, two places, by the way, in Exodus and Deuteronomy, in both places, before we get to the rules of what to do or not to do, God says this: I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Because all the commandments and all the laws, first and foremost, are about God. God's faithfulness and love for us before it's about anything that we can do. We don't obey commandments and follow rules to earn God's love or salvation. All that is already done. It's taken care of. All that we can do is live in response to what God has done for us. So the commandments start with who God is, and God is love. That was the first week. Then last week, the next theme was love God. Pastor Tim put it this way: we love others and ourselves best when we love God the most. It makes sense. Since God is love, when we love God, it makes it easier for us to love one another. That's why the first three commandments, our first set, are about how to love God. Let's think about those. The first commandment, worship God alone and don't worship any idols. That's the first commandment. Worship God alone. Have no other gods before me. But what is that about? As Pastor Tim said, don't worship any idols. An idol is something that you devote yourself to, something that you spend all your time and your energy and give your attention to. So when we worship something other than God, like our image or our status or our pursuit of wealth or power, then those things become idols. And they get in the way of us loving God, which means they also get in the way of us loving one another. Because we're not really able to love our neighbor if we're too caught up in ourselves. So worship God alone. That's the first commandment. And the second commandment, you shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. Or the shorter version, don't use the Lord's name in vain. That's what you've probably heard. I used to think that this command was about swearing. Like, God doesn't like it when you swear, but if you have to swear, for goodness sakes, don't use God, Lord, Jesus, Christ, or any combination thereof, because God gets kind of offended by that. That's what I used to think this meant. But I've learned since that there's something deeper going on in this commandment. You see, when we talk about someone's name, what we're actually talking about is their reputation. So if a scandal comes out about some public figure who used to have a good reputation, we might say that it's tarnished their good name. It's hurt their name, because we're really talking about their reputation. So with that in mind, think about the commandment this way: don't misuse or don't damage God's reputation. Because what you do and what you say in the name of God matters. What you do under the banner of Christianity or religion matters. Think of all the people who have been hurt and who have turned away from God because of things Christians have done in God's name. Throughout the Crusades, through the colonial period, it was Christians who were conquering and killing in the name of God, using religion to justify what they were doing. Christians took slaves from Africa. Christians killed and displaced Native Americans on this continent. Christians oppressed foreigners and women and people of color and the LGBT community, and we do it all in the name of our God. Here's the thing. What happens when we do that is we are more known, instead of being known for what Jesus did, for accepting and loving the outsiders, Jesus, who was accused of hanging out too much with the sinners, we get known for judging and rejecting people who are different from us. And that's what it looks like to misuse God's name, to tarnish God's reputation. It's not about God being offended when we swear. It's about doing things in God's name that don't reflect who God is. And God is love. It's the God that we see in Jesus. So don't misuse the name or the reputation of God. And then the next commandment after that was the Sabbath, which, if you were here, we talked about back in June. It's a command to rest and make one day a week holy as a way of honoring God. But that commandment, again, isn't just about honoring God, it's also about caring for one another. That's the reason why God says, when you rest, make sure that everyone in your household rests. and all the people who work for you, and all the animals, and the foreigners in your town. Make sure that they get to rest too. Because it's about honoring God so that we can better love one another. That's what the first 3 commands are about. Loving God so that we can better love one another. But the next set of commandments, the ones Pastor Tim read from Exodus today, they are explicitly about how we act with other people, which is why the theme for today is love others. Love others. And what we find is that all of these commands, they're really about God shaping the community. God trying to make this world we live in a better place when we obey these commandments. So let's look at them. The first commandment for today is honor your father and mother. That's the commandment. And it comes with an explanation. So that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Isn't that interesting? An interesting reason? What I hear more often is the reason you should honor your parents is because they're authority figures like God, and authority figures must be obeyed and never questioned. Too often that's how we teach this commandment to our kids. Obey me, just like you obey God. That's not what God says. God says honor your parents because guess what? Life will be easier if you do. Life will be better for you if you honor your father and your mother. And there's another depth of meaning here too. When you remember that all the 10 commandments were written to an adult audience. Think about it. Adultery, that's an adult concern. Murdering, most of the time, an adult concern. The Sabbath talks about your children and your household because it's written with adults in mind. That doesn't mean that the commandments don't apply to our kids. What it means is that it was first and foremost for adults. So the command to honor our parents isn't primarily about when we're growing up. It's actually a command for adults to continue to honor our parents as they get older. It's a command to take care of the elderly in our society. Scholars believe that at this point in Israel's history, for much of it, they lived and functioned as a patrilocal society. So they were family units that worked together. You would live in one household or in a complex, and your whole family would work together as an economic unit to survive. When someone got married, the wife would move in with her husband's family and join the unit, and everyone would work together. The problem is, when you got older, and your body stopped working the way it used to, and you couldn't contribute to all the work for the household anymore, you had to rely on the people in your family to take care of you. Oftentimes, that's still true today, but think about it, thousands of years ago, there was no Social Security or savings or pension or retirement. The only thing you could do when you got older was hope that your family would take care of you into old age. So when God says, honor your father and mother so the days may be long for you, God is saying, if you take care of the elderly in your family, chances are better that the next generation will take care of you when you get older. It's in your own interest. It's better for everyone when we honor our parents. It's better for society as a whole when we take care of the vulnerable groups of people, like the elderly among us. The next commandment, you shall not murder. Now, this commandment, there's a lot of debate among scholars about what exactly that means. Basically, is it a command not to kill or not to murder? Some translators say you can't take life under any circumstance. That's what this means. While others say there are some circumstances where you're within the law, within your rights, to take another human life. There are good arguments I've heard on both sides, so I don't need to get into that, because the point, regardless, is the same. The point is clear. Killing is bad. We know that. Killing is bad. It's bad for the person who dies, but it's also bad for the community as a whole, because nothing tears apart a community like acts of violence. This is true today, but it was even more important back in a tribal society because of this. There was no police force. Think about that. There was no criminal justice system like we know today, a modern criminal justice system. So picture it. Someone in your family, someone you love is murdered, and you know who did it, but you can't call the police because there are no police. So what are your options? You might go after that person, try and get revenge on that murderer. Of course, you know if you do that, someone in their family might come back after you, and so on and so forth. So maybe the best thing is to take your whole family, your whole tribe, and slaughter their whole family. That happened. It happens. Because unchecked violence has a way of escalating, of cycling, going back and forth. And there's nothing that destroys a community like violence. That's the reason, by the way, why some of the laws in the Old Testament sound so barbaric. They're calling for killing one another. And then the one commandment, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that sounds horrible. But think about it. If someone gives you a black eye, you feel like you're justified in getting revenge. But if you have to do that, you're not allowed to beat them to death. You can only give them a black eye in return. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, life for life, and no more. That's the point, to stop the escalation of violence. It sounds barbaric, and it is, but for that time, when there was no police force, it was a way to try and keep that violence in check. But I hope that you remember what Jesus said about that. He said, "You have heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, that's not good enough, folks. That's not good enough. Don't resist evildoers. Love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you." Because Jesus is saying, don't you get it? Violence tears apart communities. Even if you feel justified, even if you are justified in hurting somebody, that's just going to continue those cycles of violence and tear your community apart. The next commandment is don't commit adultery. Just like violence tears apart community, we know that adultery tears apart families. That's true today, of course. But think about some of the implications in a society like Israel's, where the authority and the land was passed down through male descendants in those family units. Think about it. If a married man in one family cheated on his wife with a married woman in another family and she had a son, they didn't know for sure who the father was. So what was that boy supposed to inherit? Maybe he would inherit his father's property and bring that over to his mother's family, or maybe the other way around. You see, in both families, their future was uncertain. They didn't know what was going to happen because of one act of poor judgment. This is about adultery. It's about the emotional damage that it can cause, certainly, but it's also about tearing families apart. It's better for everyone in the community when we're faithful in our relationships and honor our commitments. That's another layer to this commandment. The next commandment I won't say too much about. Don't steal. We understand stealing is bad. It hurts people, obviously. But also it's bad for society because when people are stealing from one another, then it sows seeds of distrust. We can't trust anyone when people start to steal from one another. So don't steal. And then the last commandment for today, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, this command is more specific than saying don't lie. It's saying bear false witness, which would happen in a legal setting. Now, like I just said, there wasn't a modern criminal justice system, but at different times there were tribal leaders who would try and arbitrate disputes, and people would bring cases to them. And just like today, those cases would rely heavily upon witness testimony. And if you lie as a witness, give false testimony, it hurts whoever you're lying about, but it also hurts the legal system. It starts to erode trust in it. And when you don't trust that legal system, you're more likely to go outside of it. And we're back to those cycles of revenge and violence. And that's what this is really trying to avoid. You see what all these commands have in common? Yes, they're about a few people in our personal lives not being hurt, but they're also for the common good. It's God trying to make our community a better place to live in. That's what God wanted for Israel, and it's what God wants for us today, to make this world a better place. The problem with the Ten Commandments, though, is if we see them as a finish line instead of a place to start. If all you do is follow the Ten Commandments, you're setting the bar pretty low. Yes, it's good not to kill your neighbors, but I think we can go a little further than that. Jesus pushes us a little further. That's why Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, "You have heard it said, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, even if you're just angry If you're angry with a brother or sister, you'll be liable to judgment. If you insult someone, you'll be liable to the council. And if you call someone a fool, you'll be liable to hell. Woo! I haven't killed anyone, but we've all been angry. We've all said and done things out of anger that we shouldn't do. The point is, we should keep growing. We all have room to grow here in our love for one another. Jesus also says this, "You have heard it said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you, everyone who even looks at somebody with lust in their heart has already committed adultery." Mic drop, right? The point is, yes, it's good if you don't cheat on your spouse. That's a good start. That's good, Larry. I'm glad you haven't done that. I'm glad. But now let's work on not objectifying any people, any men, women, or children around us. Let's keep going. There's always room to grow. The hard part about this, since we always keep growing, is that we never actually get there. We can't actually do all these things all the time. We just can't love God and love each other with everything we've got, every moment of our lives. It's not possible unless you're Jesus. We just can't do it. So remember where we started. It's about God's love and God's faithfulness first. That's what counts. So trust God. Trust God. Trust that even despite all of our flaws, the times that we fall short, when we follow Jesus, God will help us to continue to grow in our love for one another so we can make this world a better place. Amen.